Hello, hello, and welcome once again to a Beatles program that we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly show in which we talk about anything Beatles. It could be about their past, the present, anything that comes to our mind. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the regular co-hosts of the show. You might know me from my other Beatles program, a syndicated Beatles show called Every Little Thing. And I'm being joined by my three regular co-hosts. Let's start with the man who's been writing for Beatle Fan since the very beginning of the magazine, that being Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
And also one of the other writers for Beatle Fan and a freelance writer and musicologist, we have Alan Kozin. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And also, we have the man who every single day puts together news for us on Beatles Examiner. He fills us in with what's going on in the Beatle world, keeps everything up to date for us, that being Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hello, Ken. Hello, everyone.
You're stealing my line there, Steve.
I know. I'm sorry. I couldn't help it.
On the program this time, we're going to do something in which we're just basically going to talk about radio. And I know that one of us made the suggestion to discuss our memories, whatever memories we have about the Beatles growing up, 60s, solo years, whatever, our favorite memories we could share, in particular, that really stands out in our minds, some great memories that we have related to radio. No doubt so many of our listeners have memories just like this, whether you grew up during the Beatle time in the 60s, certain things that happen on the radio, special events, maybe new releases, new albums. Maybe the Beatles came to your town and they were talking about it on the radio. And then there's all the solo stuff that followed as well. So I thought we'd each share our own particular memories, the things that probably mean the most to each of us. And so why don't we start with you, Al? Can you talk about some things? We'll talk first of all about the 60s, first of all, in particular, and what stands out in your memory growing up in the 60s, what great memories you have, in particular with radio.
Well, no, I'm a radio junkie, so I'm gonna have to really keep this short, or else this is gonna go on for the next 18 hours. And but it's something that's very interesting, and I wrote about this in Changing Times, and also Bruce Spicer wrote about it in The Beatles Are Coming. The fact that and we even did a sort of a debate on this at the Fest for Beatles Fans back in February of 2014. The fact that I've always felt that despite the fact that Capitol Records put on this very large for the time and very expensive publicity campaign, the whole Beatles Are Coming campaign, that really radio kind of co-opted Capitol, because the momentum really began to build before the Capitol had much of a chance to really roll out the campaign, because it was in mid-December that Carol James in Washington played I Want to Hold Your Hand, and it debuted in New York the day after Christmas, 1963. And then it exploded in the first week of January of 1964, and it was at that point that I first heard the word Beatles. It was Tuesday night, January 7th, 1964, when Scott Muni debuted the top 7 on WABC in New York, and I heard this record by this group that I had never heard of before, called this record called "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And what happened in the weeks following that it was absolutely amazing, because it was as if this group that, as I said, most Americans had never heard of, on New Year's Day, within 2 weeks, they were totally dominating what was rapidly becoming the biggest top 40 station in America. And it continued. Of course, this was the era. It became, the next 3 years became the era of WA Beatles C. but
Right.
also its competitors in New York, at least the first year, WINS was still playing rock and roll, and that was, of course, spearheaded by Murray the K, who latched on to the Beatles as hard as he could, and proclaimed himself the fifth Beatle and all of that. But despite all of that self promotion, it didn't really help all that much, because within a year, Murray had left WINS, and within another 2 months, WINS went all news. And then there was WMCA, which was the third top 40 station in New York. And this was the era when the nighttime DJ was really, as opposed to now when the morning show is the centerpiece of a station. In those days, it was the nighttime DJ. And the nighttime DJ on WMCA was B. Mitchell Reed, whose basic musical roots were really rooted more in blues and jazz, and so he took kind of a, he wasn't all that enthusiastic at first about the Beatles, and kind of took them at arm's length. So he didn't embrace them in the way that Scott Muni did. Scott Muni was really, even with all of Murray the K's self-promotion, Scott Muni was the Beatles' first radio champion in New York.
Now, what do you remember? What was said initially as soon as the Beatles first got airplay? Did you hear anything about them coming to New York, being on Ed Sullivan?
Mm-hmm.
What were the comments that were made when the record was played for the first time, or that first week or so? What do you recall about that?
Well, that first week, not that much really was known. It was the first week. There really were just the three records, really just I Want to Hold Your Hand. And then almost as soon as that began taking off in the first days in January, VJ quickly re-released both From Me to You and Please Please Me on the same disc. And then Swan re-released She Loves You. And so those three songs were were all that we had at that point. And so we really didn't know that much about them. There was known that they were scheduled to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show in early February, but that was really about it. There wasn't very much information available regarding them. But there was so much enthusiasm gendered by the fact that so much excitement, I should say, engendered by those three records, that, for instance, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon every day, Dan Ingram would play on, this is again on WABC in New York, would play all three Beatles records. And that's something. This is something that in this day and age would never happen. In this day and age where everything is computerized, where every station sounds the same, and they almost never emphasize any one act above another. Something like that would just never happen. But it was very organic, and it wasn't really. It wasn't, as I said. I think the radio impact really kind of short-circuited Capitol's campaign, or at least co-opted it.
Let me ask you something, and the rest of you can chime in on this.
Mm-hmm.
Because prior to the Beatles, if you take a look at, certainly from the beginning of the rock era on, there were so few British artists that broke big here. And when they did, it would only be one hit. I mean, you did have the one exception with Lonnie Donegan, who had Rock Island Line and Does Your Chewing Gum Lose Its Flavor, which was really a novelty hit.
Yeah.
And then you had something like Telstar by the Tornadoes.
Right.
But was there an attitude maybe in radio that, we're not going to take British artists seriously because they're basically, even Cliff Richard only had one top 40 hit here in the States.
Right, and that was in the 70s.
No, he actually had Living Doll.
Oh, that's
that was
in
the 60s, but still he was nothing like he was. He was the equivalent of Elvis in England.
Well,
but was there any kind of, I don't want to say snobbery, but was there any looking down on British artists and just not taking them seriously? Was there any sense of that you heard in the very beginning when Beatles airplay, happened here. I mean, you heard so much about the media always harping on the hairstyle and everything like that, not concentrating as much about the music. You know,
Well, I think
was there
that
any of that you sensed?
Well, I think that had been the difference between the pre-Beatles British stars, because the feeling was, who needs Cliff Richard? We already have Elvis. Who needs Adam Faith? We already have, whoever, Fabian, whoever. It was felt that the British stars, for the most part, were just simply imitations of the American ones, and in many cases they were, a lot of them just simply covered records that had been hits here in the late 50s and early 60s, and things like Laurie London's He's Got the Whole World in His Hand,
Right.
and the Lonnie Donegan hits, and Telstar were really considered, and Timey Kangaroo Down Sport by Rolf
Hmm.
Harris were really
Right.
considered more novelty records than anything else. And so there just wasn't, there didn't seem to be a need for British acts to really take off here. But the Beatles were so different.
I think too the
Hmm.
thing with the Beatles was their personalities. I
Yeah.
mean, you had the John, Paul, George, and Ringo thing even before the Ed Sullivan Show, and people were just all over that. I mean, I remember, and I've mentioned this I think on here before, but I first heard about them in my seventh grade class when my best friend said they were naming their half of the class was divided into two groups, and they were naming their group after the Beatles, and to be honest, I honestly didn't know who they were until that moment, and then it started to fall together after that. But that was in the Boston area, and of course there was a lot of playing going on for anybody out in Boston and on WMEX and
Yeah. Hmm.
WBZ,
Right.
and I was lucky enough to experience Beatlemania from several different parts of the country. We moved a few years later to the New York area, and I was there in '66 when Cousin Brucey gave the Order of the All-American
Hmm.
to the Beatles live on the air. And I remember that night very, very well because I happened to be, I like to record, I had a reel-to-reel recorder and I like to record songs off the air. And I remember they were playing Words of Love, and all of a sudden they cut it off was it Words of Love or What You're Doing? I'm pretty sure it was Words of Love. But anyway, they cut it off in the middle, and Cousin Brucey goes, "We're live at the Warwick Hotel with the Beatles," and my mouth is dropping. I'm just going, "Oh my God." I'm getting this full recording on my tape recorder, and which, by the way, you can find online. It's on the
Yes.
WABC, not the regular
Music Radio
music radio.
77.com.
Right, right. That's where it's the I think the full recording is there.
Yeah.
You can hear the interview and everything. It was a great interview between. They all kind of joked. Paul especially joked that night. I remember that very well. But as far as the Beatles go, there was so much. The media went crazy. Not only radio, but TV did too. And it was just there's never. You can't compare even today. Justin Bieber, Taylor Swift, none of those people have had the media saturation that the Beatles did back then. There's just no way, But the really good part was being in the New York area and hearing WMCA and WABC go at each other. That was really an experience that you kind of wish that everybody could have been around because it was just great. They both tried to rival each other. They were both doing things, trying to get interviews and play records and stuff, and it was great. And Dave Hull, when Dave Hull was here on the show, was saying the same thing was happening in L.A. With KRLA and KHJ. It was that kind of thing was happening all over the country, and it was just so cool that the Beatles were so much a part of that, and that radio was so much a part of that. It's too bad that there isn't a lot of evidence of that. it's too bad you can't put out some of those recordings or some of those air checks. They are around. There's a couple of websites that do air checks and that have some of those Beatle things if you look around. RealRadio.com, I believe, is one of them. I haven't been there for a long, long time. I think they went subscription a while back. It used to be free, but it's not anymore, I don't think. But RealRadio.com does have some Beatles stuff on it, I believe. Not actual Beatle interviews, but Beatle related stuff. And there are places around that have that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, there were just some great DJs, Robert W. Morgan, KHJ, and the Real Don Steele were two others that did some great stuff back then. They also did the Monkees too, back when the Monkees came on. But yeah, I mean, there were just those were great days. Those really were.
Yeah, in those cities that had 2 or 3 top 40 stations, there was this huge competition for who would get the scoop of any new Beatles song. And what started happening was that one station would play a song that they had come up with, I don't know, from a Canadian single maybe, or from something else, and the competing station would then tape it. So that's how this whole thing of, first an exclusive on WABC, which would be going in and out of, the premiere of a new Beatles record, would be, how that originated.
Yeah, WBC I remember played. I think it was Beatles for Sale. Way before, and that had stuff. That had stuff that nobody else had. And so, yeah, they were doing that. The East Coast stations were doing that stuff because they could get the albums, the easiest. It was a little easier for them to get them than the West Coast stations. Out in the West Coast, can you remember when Dave Hull was with us? He was telling us about they were doing there was some real stuff going on in LA there between the stations, trying to make sure the other one didn't sneak off with the other. There was just and anybody interested should check out the Dave Hull interview we did on this show in the archives. But yeah, Allan, you're awfully quiet.
Well, it's funny. With the very early stuff, I came in slightly late. I watched them on Sullivan. My friends were all into it. We used to, hang around in each other's basement. My friends had Beatles records and everything, and so we would pick up mops and they didn't have air guitar yet, and we did mop guitar.
Oh God,
we would all sort of do that stuff. But my own actual musical interest at the time was really more classical music. So I hung out with my friends and listened to Beatles records. But at home I didn't do it that much, and but radio did play a really important part in changing my mind about that, because there's this sort of story I tell in the intro of my Fiden book, which is now called The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop. I was taking classical piano lessons, and my teacher was her father had been one of the last students of Franz Liszt. And she had, Liszt cigar butts in frames on her walls and stuff like that. Very weird, I guess that's how I got interested in memorabilia. And one day, it was I guess in the spring of '64, I was waiting for my father to pick me up. And this car full of high school kids, it was a convertible, went driving past where I was waiting, and there was a red light, so they were stopped, and they're blasting "She Loves You" on the radio, and they're all singing along, and it's high school guys and girls, and I guess that moment was also the end of my latency period, probably. It's because I just thought, okay, this is it. This is the life. You're driving around in a convertible, girls, the Beatles, everything, and so "She Loves You," and that whole thing that just seemed so magical to me that I started listening more at that point. And then from then on, it just was, you couldn't get me away from the stuff. And then I did experience the stuff that Steve and Al were talking about with ABC and MCA. And, it was great because you would come home from school. I don't know. We seem to have like a sixth sense of when a new Beatles record was coming out.
Yes.
It's been 3 months. I think there's got to be a new one. And you start listening and you start going back and forth between the two stations because you never knew which one of them was going to get it first. And then they'd get it and they'd be shouting over it and you'd be listening as close as you could. And I had, Steve, before I had a recorder, a reel-to-reel recorder, I had, for some reason, a wire recorder. Does anyone know what a wire
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Oh
I have
God.
no idea why I had this. I think my uncle might have found it in the, with his stuff, in my grandparents' basement or something, and they gave it to me. And I had like 3 or 4 spools of recording wire, and I used to sit there and record Beatles stuff on wire.
Oh,
Now, a wire
wow.
recorder was like a tape recorder, except it was very thin wire, which would very easily get knotted up or break, or. And so I began telling my father, I need more wire. And he worked down near Chamber Street and Warren Street, which is where all of these sort of hi-fi places were.
right.
And the poor guy went walking into all of these places. This is the mid 60s already, right?
Yeah.
And he's looking for recording wire, and he comes home and says, well, I asked for recording wire. They look at me like I'm a Martian. Well, of course they did. Nobody was. Recording wire was from before the 40s, probably. So,
Wow.
but he remembered it from when he was a kid, so it wasn't unnatural to him. But so I recorded. I remember having "P.S. I Love You" on my wire recorder, and very wavery sound. But yeah, my other memories. I mean, I remember when they played A Day in the Life on either ABC or MCA for maybe a day, and it was months before Sergeant Pepper came out. Someone came back with an acetate or something. And they played it, and it was immediately. I mean, they got a cease and desist from Capitol, obviously, but I remember it being like, "Wow, what are they up to?" The last thing we had heard was, what, Revolver, Yellow Submarine, Eleanor Rigby. Well, we'd heard Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, so I guess we should have had an indication. But A Day in the Life was a bit further than that. Didn't have my wire recorder going, alas. I'd love to have a tape of that early playing, see exactly what they were playing if it was finished, But yeah. So because I can't imagine, would ABC or MCA play a 5-minute track in those days?
Well, it was the Beatles, so
Yeah.
I remember ABC playing "Strawberry Fields Forever." I mean, which isn't but it was a weird enough track to where, and I also remember Dan Ingram complaining about it too. But I mean, they were really sensitive to to listenable stuff, and when the Beatles started to get a little crazier, they were they got a little nervous about that. So.
Yeah. I do remember Penny Lane being played with the trumpet ending, when ABC and MCA first played it, they were playing that promo.
Yeah.
I remember that too.
Yeah, and so then I remember it coming out and not having it. I think I was a little disappointed.
Me too.
Yeah,
as a matter of fact.
I definitely was too.
Yeah. In fact, I heard the night before in, I don't know, sometime in like the middle of June of '65 on WMCA. But it was like a multi-generational copy of it. It sounded like it had been recorded over the telephone or something. And I have no idea. And of course, I think it probably lasted on the air about 3 hours or something before the cease and desist order came, and then didn't hear it again until August when the Help album finally came out.
Yeah, I remember as well. I think it was WABC FM, and I recently got a tape of this to refresh my memory. When WABC FM had 10 tracks from the White Album. and
Yes.
they were in really not great shape. And I remember them saying, we're going to play it now tonight, but then we're going to take it and have the tape equalized, and it'll sound better tomorrow. But and I did tape that, but I didn't keep the tape. Because the album came out, but who knows what those mixes were. It was early, and only 10 tracks. One of them was Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey, and they didn't call it that. They called it, something else. So, they were just guessing what the titles were.
I
They
think
didn't
that
know.
tape may also be on the Music Radio 77 website, because I was sent a copy of it I don't know, a couple of years ago. I think somebody who knew that I was a fan of Bob Lewis, who was the DJ who hosted that show. And so I think it is out there.
The tape that's around is one of the repeats, one of the next day or so, a bit later. I have that Bob Lewis one too, and it's very interesting also hearing his analysis, of the Beatles jamming and stuff like that. But it was only 10 songs, and it was great having it for a few weeks before the record came out, and I think it was mono mixes, and the same with Get Back, what became the Let It Be album. I mean, those tracks were around for ages. I mean, Capitol must have been keeping its lawyers extremely busy with cease and desists, because there was WBCN had played the whole acetate of the Glyn Johns mix, and I guess the New York stations may have gotten it from that.
I remember hearing it on again WABC FM sometime in, I'd say, November of '69, because I can remember hearing it. I was at a a local high school dance, and talking to guys in the band, and they were playing it on the on their speaker system.
Yeah, I seem to remember hearing it before Abbey Road came out.
Oh yeah,
because then Abbey Road came out, and it's but this isn't. How can this be the new album? The last didn't even come out yet.
Right. Yeah.
But and the New York State FM stations played 2 or 3 different versions of Let It Be by the time the thing finally came out.
Yeah.
And I had taped those too. Those I think I might have kept. Also taped all of those Howard Smith interviews.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
In fact, I remember hearing the interview that he did with Dave Morell.
That's right.
On the night that it ran.
That's right. I did too. Yeah. In fact, I taped it, but I think my tape ran out because I don't have the whole interview, and the only bootlegs that are out there, I believe, come from my tape, because they all end in the same place. But now they put them out officially. So
right.
But yeah, so those are great. Later on, I mean, I heard Dennis Ellis having John Lennon on. I didn't hear Scott Muni's John Lennon interview until years later.
Yeah, and that was a lot, not nearly as interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Which is funny, because they were sort of, they kind of knew each other for a long time. They were sort of friends, It's funny that it wasn't that interesting, but what can you do?
Yeah.
So, the funny, it's funny, the whole Beatles radio thing. I mean, it's a very sort of vivid part of my, childhood into adolescence. And, just the whole thing of coming home and going back and forth between the 2 stations when you thought there's probably something coming out. And, you probably did that for weeks and weeks before you heard something.
Yeah.
But it was an exciting time, because, now we know all this stuff, but we didn't know it then. We never knew what we were going to hear.
Right.
It was,
yeah.
Suddenly it was Lady Madonna, and wow, what's that whole piano thing? That's unlike,
right. Which was definitely like a left hand or right hand turn from Magical Mystery Tour.
Yeah, I remember also hearing Revolution for the first time.
Yeah.
And really wasn't, I didn't catch the, I guess the announcement of what it was going to be. I might have turned on in the middle of it, and
Mm-hmm.
it sounded kind of like John to me, but they had never put anything that rocky out before. And I remember thinking, yeah, I wonder what the Beatles would think of this, and then they announced it. And so I guess they like it. So, yeah, and then Hey Jude, this thing's going on endlessly, and yeah, it was always a surprise. It was always a surprise, and it was always a great surprise. It was, I don't remember ever feeling like I don't really like this one. It was like
Mm.
everything was an adventure, and it was always like, okay, I can go there. This is great.
Hmm.
So solo
That's
stuff,
that's
I don't
really
really I probably wasn't listening by then, to well, no, I was. I mean, the early Lennon stuff I was a lot. McCartney stuff in those days of the sort of just post Beatles transition, it was very polarized. And Paul was putting out, I kind of liked Another Day. I hated Admiral Halsey, Uncle Albert. I
that's
hated
surprising.
Mary Had a Little Lamb. I mean, to me, it was just all like, okay, so obviously the brains of the operation was John, but
That's
but
how you thought back then?
that's how I thought back then. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it was very, me and my friends. It was sort of like all, you were either a John guy or a Paul guy, and I liked John's stuff a lot better at that point, and it's just the way it was. I mean, when then Band on the Run came out, it's like, okay, maybe he does have it still, um,
Boy, you're
and
being
then.
rather harsh.
Well, I'm just saying what my
Yeah,
feeling at the time
what you
as a
thought.
kid was. I
Yeah,
mean, I listened to
yeah.
the albums before that now, much more willingly. Even Wildlife, which I absolutely loathed when it came out. I mean, Bip Bop was really just giving everybody ammunition. But I like Wildlife now. I mean, it is what it is. It's at a particular stage in his career, and you kind of have to think of it in those terms. And in those days, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was thinking of, okay, this is what each of them are putting out, and I like this, and I don't like that.
Right.
You know,
Mm.
Ringo didn't get much airplay in those days. You didn't get Blue Coops of Blues on the radio or Sentimental Journey very
Oh sure,
much.
oh sure. Well, not Sentimental Journey, but certainly It Don't Come Easy got
It
a
don't
lot
come
of
easy,
Yeah.
yeah,
airplay.
And
right.
then back
That's
off
right.
Boogaloo.
Yeah.
And
So
George, I remember ABC FM was, or maybe by then they were PLJ.
Yeah.
They used to play a lot of All Things Must Pass, and that was great stuff. But yeah, anyway, but my strongest memories really are of the group stuff. That was what I would sit there and listen for. I don't remember sort of sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for a solo album to come out. Sorry.
now on the flip side of that, no, actually, you seem to have a lot of memories tied to radio there, Alan. That's great. But as far as, the 60s are concerned, I was pretty young back then, but I still vividly remember 1964 and just hearing nonstop Beatles all the time on the radio. I wasn't listening to analyze between WABC and WMCA what was going on. To me, it was just fun radio. And most of the time, I listened to WABC. I mean, that station was my life in the 60s and the 70s.
Sure.
And not just because of the music, but because of the DJs. And they made it all fun. And all the DJs were different in their own way. They all had their own style. And in 64, like you were saying, Al, it was radio saturation. And I just
Yeah.
remember hearing one Beatles song after another. And I had a little transistor radio that I kept glued to my ear. And I loved it. I was just totally immersed in all the music of that time, but especially the Beatles. And just being exposed to all that music. As a little kid, I was pretty up on everything that the Beatles released, even though I wasn't aware of if they were ever on the radio talking, being interviewed. I wasn't really following that because I guess I was too young to really be that observant at the time of that kind of thing. But as the records came out, I had the singles and the albums, or one of my aunts used to buy me Beatles stuff. So I pretty much had everything close to when they were released. But I remember very well when Hey Jude came out, hearing it on one station, turning to another top 40 station and hearing the Nana Hey Heys, hearing the beginning of the song on one and hearing the Nanas, the Nana Hey Heys on another station, just to see how Hey Jude just completely dominated the charts back then. But nothing, like you guys have said, can ever compare to 1964 and what happened on the radio back then. And it wasn't just the Beatles. It was, you had to add a lot of the other stuff that we either knew at the time or later discovered were Lennon-McCartney songs given to Peter and Gordon and
Sure.
Billy J. Kramer and those people, and the whole British invasion thing. It was a really magical time, and it's really fascinating, what you said, Alan, and it is so true, and it may seem very obvious that when has there ever been a time when on hit radio a group would put out a new single, say every 3 months
Yeah.
or every 4 months, and sometimes it might be two singles from the same album, but then you knew there'd be something entirely new that you never heard before, and it just kept gushing out for a long period of time. And it wasn't until like the later 60s, 67, there were 3 singles that year from the Beatles. In 68, there were 2. So they were slowing down with the singles. But still, those early years were just amazing as far as top 40 was concerned. And, my biggest memory of anything at all connected with the Beatles is one that you mentioned, Alan, and that is when John Lennon was on Dennis Els's show, because that could be my favorite interview I've ever heard from any of them. I mean, there are some that are more intense from John, especially the one he gave to David Wigg in 1971, which is, probably my favorite of all of John's interviews. Extremely powerful interview. Very bitter at that time, but, he was speaking his mind. But in 74 with Dennis, it was promoting Walls and Bridges, the new album at the time, but he also got John to open up about a lot of things about the Beatles that we never heard before. And apart from the fact that it was, just a great interview, John was so funny and he was so naturally funny. I mean, I've interviewed Dennis and Steve and I have interviewed Dennis about that interview. And I said to him, that interview is just too good to be true. The timing of it, it's not just the fact that John was, such a great personality on the air and so naturally funny, but look at the timing of it all. There were commercials that they were plugging for Goodnight Vienna at that time.
Right.
The last quarter of 1974, you had all that solo Beatles stuff. There was even the Mahavishnu Orchestra, produced by George Martin. Coming out of it's like it was. Is this a setup? It's like how could it be more perfect? And then you can just talk about George Martin for a while if you wanted to do that. And he was so funny, just reading the weather, telling Beatles stories and enlightening us on stuff we never heard about before. Like using a reggae arrangement in that solo part, and I Call Your Name, which was really, ahead of its time on a pop record, really. And the whole bit about the Bobby Parker record, Watch Your Step, which influenced Day Tripper. And I Feel Fine. Actually, more I Feel Fine, but there's a little bit in Watch Your Step, if you listen very carefully, where the riff from Day Tripper, you can hear a little bit of that in there too. But just hearing all that and to know that John was aware of ELO, at the time, and to play Showdown on the interview. And, it was a really cool interview. And Dennis deserves a lot of credit for getting so much out of John during that interview. It was a very magical one, just on all levels, and
That's
to
true.
learn stuff about the new album. So, and I happened to be listening when that happened. A friend of mine told me, hey, you got to turn on NEW. John's on. So I missed the first few minutes, but I heard it when it was happening. And it still is. It's one of those few interviews where I've memorized so much of the lines.
Sure.
Kind of like, we memorize A Hard Day's Night and Help and lines and that. There's a lot that John said in that interview that, I can recite. So that was a great time.
Oh, I was going to say the Howard Smith interviews, by the way, are coming out in book form. I just wrote about that last week or the week before. So,
Yeah, that'll be handy to have. You can look stuff up.
Mhm.
But the interviews themselves, I mean, John's interviews were just so great in terms of, the personality that comes through, and those Howard Smith interviews too, because, he would turn up at their house while they were having, say, ABC was having an all Beatles day, and so you would hear the radio on in the background, and sometimes John would turn it up and listen to this for a couple of seconds and then start talking about the song. That was just great. That was probably the same one that Dave Morrell turned up on that show. But also, the Howard Smith one started out with much shorter interviews, because I think he started, and Zachary too, on NEW at the same time, around the time of the bed-ins in Toronto.
Yeah.
John was talking to everybody, and everybody who could get him on the phone was broadcasting an interview. So I sat there with my reel-to-reel recorder going crazy. It was like, okay, let's see who's got one now.
Right.
So, yeah, and all that stuff I kept. I mean, eventually I sort of realized that you can't erase them.
Same thing with me with cassette tapes. I used to tape a lot of interviews over the radio. A lot of interviews with the solo Beatles.
Yeah.
One thing to mention, particularly for the first generation people, is that the whole British invasion thing was just completely insane, in '64. And actually, you kind of get a little feeling of that now with the the return of the zombies recently. I mean, that kind of, any British group was gold back then. I mean, you had the Dave Clark Five, the Animals, the Hollies. I mean, there were just so many. There were some Peter and Gordon. We've talked with Peter Essure. I mean, it's just Chet and Jeremy. I mean, there was just so much going on back in those days, and it was just such a wonderful time. And I don't know how people feel about the '60s, but I really think that the music back then was unbeatable. I mean, you can't get any better than that stuff. Sorry, Ken, but I mean, we're really giving it to you about that.
Well, I guess I think everybody feels that the music that they kind of grew up with is the best. I'm sure I know there are people that grew up in the '80s and feel that the 80s music is unbeatable. Even strange as it may seem, there are people that grew up in the '90s that are very nostalgic about that stuff, and I'm sure it'll be the same thing with the kids that are now listening to Taylor Swift and
yeah, but Al,
stuff.
Objectively speaking, we grew up with the Beatles.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. And we were very spoiled, not only with the Beatles but also with the Who and Dylan and the Stones and everything else. So I absolutely feel that we grew up in a very special time. And that the especially the historical quality of the music of that time is pretty much unbeatable. But other people obviously are going to feel just that the music was what they kind of grew up with. That's what they feel most comfortable with.
Well, just to clarify something here, I have the deepest appreciation for the music of the '60s. I love the '60s. And just what I've found, not only with the '60s, but with a lot of the decades, my appreciation has grown even more for older music. And my favorite decade has always been the '70s, but it's not just because my teenage years were the '70s. I genuinely think that was a Renaissance period, as was the '60s. And I don't like all this constant comparison, which is better. I love it all. It's just great music still continued. It's only when people start saying, well, it was never the same after the '60s. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I can point to from the '70s and '80s that I think was absolutely beyond amazing. But I will never deny the greatness of the '60s. So don't ever group me into this thing where, I'm all post '60s. I love it all. With me, it's more an appreciation of everything instead of just singling out one thing. And where the solo Beatles are concerned, I still contend that they still put out great songs on their own that never stopped. They didn't have to have each other just to put out great music. They still continued putting out great music on their own. And sometimes we should just not be so concerned about which is the best, just
Mhm.
that there's great music out there for everyone
Sure.
to appreciate. So there you go. There's my
Yeah.
rant.
Sure. And when you really think about it, the '70s are actually probably a more diverse was a the that era musically was probably more diverse than the '60s were, because you had it was like the Wild West musically, because almost it was like anything goes,
Right.
any kind of
Mhm.
any particular genre was, whether it was glam rock or or heavy metal, or kind of teeny bopper pop, or ack disco, or or the early new wave and punk rock, things like that. And then that just scratches the surface. There's prog rock, there's sort of the kind of symphonic rock that the Moody Blues and ELO were doing,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Hmm.
and on and on.
Mhm.
So when you really think about it, the '70s were probably a more diverse time, but
It's
uh,
probably true.
yeah, but
And
the '60s were when the barriers that kind of the barriers fell that led the way to all of
right.
that diversity.
I
Mhm.
would make a strong case for 1804 to 1827 and 1899 to 1920. Um, but that's in my other life.
Right.
But
That was very well put, Al. I mean, I couldn't have said it any better, really, because that's what I love the most about the '70s is this wide range of music. I mean, this explains between the Beatles and top 40 radio growing up in the '60s and '70s, I was exposed to every kind of genre of music.
Right.
And I wasn't one of those people who said, I only like the rock and roll. I was listening to the Osmonds, One Bad Apple, and Whole Lot of Love from Led Zeppelin on the same station and
Sure.
liking them both.
Hmm.
So that also explains, I mean, if you go into the Beatles catalog, you've got something as heavy as Helter Skelter and Revolution, and then you go right to Honey Pie.
Right.
And when you're exposed to all that, you either develop a deep appreciation like I have, or you just go in one direction and just like one thing. And I was never one of those people because I was hit with all this music all at once. And then there's so much music that I appreciated much more later on. One of the things that I liked a bit in the '70s that I love to death now is all the Philadelphia soul that came out of the '70s, the OJs and stuff like that. I love that music. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. There's so much that came out of that decade, from the bubblegum to the heavy rock to the progressive rock to the singers songwriters, the James Taylors, and then there's all the solo Beatles stuff. And
Hmm.
Stevie Wonder, what he put out in the '70s was beyond amazing as far as I'm concerned.
Hmm.
So I mean that's what radio has had as an effect on me. So yeah, and also going into the solo Beatles stuff with radio, there's all the radio specials, the interview shows, the off the records.
Hmm.
um Rockline was exciting, even though sometimes you couldn't get too in depth with
Hmm.
any of the Beatles. It was pretty surface stuff. But one favorite memory of mine is when George Harrison was on Rockline when
Mhm.
Cloud Nine came out and Jeff Flynn joined them, and they did this whole medley with Everly Brothers stuff. And it was really wonderful. And when you're listening to it live as it's happening, that makes it even the more special. And that's
Hmm.
another thing that I miss a lot about radio in general is the live aspect of it. And a lot of people don't care about that anymore. Especially a lot of young people,
Hmm.
in this
Mhm.
on-demand world that we live in. So yeah, that made it even the more exciting to me.
Things like the Beatles at the Beeb.
Mhm.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So although a lot of that stuff wasn't live as it was happening,
Well,
but it was
yeah,
still, you
sure.
know, it was still exciting at the time. It was only maybe, in some cases a week apart or a few days before, between when it was recorded and when it was broadcast.
Hmm.
So,
I remember Dave talking about how do you do it. I remember
mhm.
Dave talking about that, and I remember sitting in my car in cold weather, waiting for that thing to come on the radio because they
when did
said
you
they
first hear that?
I don't remember. Seems to me it would probably I remember where I was living, so it would have to be in the '70s sometime.
Yeah, I think
I
NEW played it once in one of their Beatles A to Z
yeah.
things, and it was the early '70s, and I remember being offended isn't the right word, but it was like, wait a minute. There
Mm,
cannot exist a Beatles record that I don't have.
yeah,
What is
right.
that doing on the radio? And we knew what it was because we'd all read about how they recorded it and didn't want it out. But
Well,
that was when I
well,
guess I discovered bootlegs.
I think
I remember KFRC telling everybody that they were going to play the song, and they did, and they introduced it, and somewhere I have a tape of what they played. I don't and how they introduced it, but I remember them playing it, and I was just they didn't play it very often, so I mean they went several hours between playing it, and you never knew exactly when they were going to play it, and they finally played it, and it was like, wow, this is fantastic. It was great.
So they
I
must have
don't
been playing it off the bootleg single that came out around
yeah,
that
then.
because I think
that must yeah, I think so.
which I think Joe Pope
That's right.
had a role in at least a role in putting it out. I'm not sure
I
it may
think
have been.
I think this was before the single. I seem to remember it coming out before the single because I remember seeing the single, and in fact all those Decagon records in Berkeley
Hmm.
and buying them. I remember they were like $6 a piece, I believe, and I remember buying them all at once. But I believe How Do You Do It was on the air before that.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
I'm pretty positive. So.
Mm.
And then there was also the first BBC radio special, where it was all BBC recordings.
Right.
Wasn't that around 1981? I think that
I
aired.
think 82.
82.
Okay.
That was the Beatles at the Beeb Memorial Day weekend of '82,
Hmm. Oh
which
Yeah.
God,
was which
that was
was that was an event
Yeah.
with a
It
capital.
was
it
an
was.
event, and it was kind of an interesting event if you were a bootleg collector because
Yes.
you not only had a lot of those tracks, but remember, bootlegs all came from different quality tapes, and
Yes.
sometimes there'd
Hmm.
be a little buzz in one, and so you could tell which bootlegs they were using
Mhm.
Hmm.
because some of them, were bootlegs. I mean, they were very open about it that they had erased their tapes and that
Yeah.
they solicited. They basically put out an ad in the Listener, which was the BBC's magazine, saying, "Well, you may remember when these shows were on, we told you that we didn't want people taping them, but if you happen to have, could you get in touch with us?" But otherwise, they used boots too, and it was then the next time they did the show, newer tapes turned up, and they replaced the
Hmm.
boots with the buzzes with
Yeah.
fresher ones, and so those shows became a source of new material for all of us collecting it too.
And around that time, Rip Rents did the series in the Herald Examiner about the
Yeah.
BBC
That's right.
stuff, and that was a landmark series, because a lot of people didn't learn about or learned about that stuff from that series, and that
Mhm.
of course got everybody interested in it. So.
Yeah.
And just a few years later, a show that I know Ken is all too familiar with, the Lost
Yeah.
London tapes.
Sure. Oh,
Hmm.
what a treasure that was.
Sure.
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean, I love every aspect of that show. The fact that every single week there's something there that you didn't hear, and even if
Hmm.
it's not, I mean, to me the most interesting thing is a composition that you never heard before. But if you hear an alternate take or a different mix or an interview clip that you never heard before, and there was
Mhm.
always something week to week that you never heard,
Okay.
and that just made it so fascinating to me. And
Hmm.
I think between bootlegs and hearing a show like that, when you hear alternate takes, when you hear different versions of songs, it makes you, it gives you more interest and it makes you appreciate the music even more
Hmm.
when you hear different versions. And maybe you pick up on something in the song that you never heard before. To this day now, I just love demos to death, because you
Hmm.
get to see songs in their infancy, and there's so many changes that could take place from that moment to the finished product, and all that I find fascinating. And like I said, when a show like that was just really, you heard so many early versions of songs that John later released, and
Hmm.
later on it was bootlegged on vinyl and on CD without Elliot Mintz's voice in there, and you just had the songs. And I treasure a lot of that stuff, especially the songs that John didn't release. A lot of the late '70s stuff that was supposed to be in that musical that he and Yoko apparently were planning about.
Yeah.
I love that stuff. Whatever
Well,
happened
plus
to those songs?
that show gave us the first listen to the Essure demos for the White Album. That was really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That wasn't available on boot before then?
No. That was
Wow.
and basically it was from the Yoko had given them all of her tape archive, and they cataloged it, and the first complete batch of the Essure tapes leaked out from there. It wasn't even all broadcast. It was someone managed to get a copy out of Westwood One and put it out on on one of those Lost Lennon tapes bootlegs, the one with the Richard Avedon cover, you remember?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that was quite a haul. When that show was, I mean, by the time that was going on, I was sort of like in my adult professional life. So I interviewed Yoko, I interviewed Elliot Mintz, before it all happened, and it was interesting, and also Steve Peoples, who was the person at Westwood One who was putting it together. And it was really interesting hearing about, what their plans were, because they had just done a few by the time I did the interviews, and it was, the piece was coming out before the sort of introductory 3-hour show. So, yeah, I mean, you didn't know what that show was going to be, but it went on for like 219 episodes. That's a lot of material.
Yeah. And I had the privilege of playing it on the air because I was on WDHA in New Jersey at the time.
Right.
And I was on from 7 in the morning till 10 with my show. And then the Lost Lennon Tapes was on at 6 o'clock. So I had a lot of people waking up very early.
One of whom was me.
And no doubt recording that show and then listening to me. I benefited from that.
Yeah.
So, and I even did a lot of radio specials based on material from that show. So, I loved it.
I sort of lucked out there. I never actually had to listen to Lost Lennon Tapes on the radio because they sent me the discs.
Oh, wow.
That was really nice.
Where they remain the same.
Yes. And, it's when I moved to Maine, the day that our movers were there, they were taking all the boxes out and stuff. And the next morning, one of our neighbors came by and said, there's one of your boxes of records was out on the street, and I brought it into the lobby. And it was one whole box of Lost Lennon tapes. Those would have been irreplaceable.
Wow.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, how they managed to survive a night on a New York street corner without someone taking them, I have no idea. But yeah,
there's one other thing about radio, and I've always been a chart buff. I've memorized how far singles go, how far albums go. Certainly with the Beatles, I have it. I'm pretty much almost 100% accurate when it comes to those things. And I used to write down every single week the top 40 charts and listen to American Top 40 with Casey Kasem, and always rooting for the solo Beatles single of the time to, climb up the charts.
Sure.
So those were exciting times, and to know which ones went to number one, which ones went to went in the top 10. An exciting time was 1976 when you had Wings having their hits at the same time that Got to Get You Into My Life was a top 10 single, stuff like that I remember so well. And listening to American Top 40 every single week, which, like I said, exposed me to so many different styles of music at the time. And, seeing how well the solo Beatles were doing, which sometimes a lot of people aren't aware of the success that the Beatles had on their own. And if you just take a look at the charts and you take a look at the facts, you'd be surprised how many top 10 hits and number ones they had on their solo careers, their solo careers.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, especially the period from 1970, let's say through 76. That was that was an amazing. I mean, they had successes after that, but certainly in those 6 years, they had an amazing amount of success.
Yeah, well, remember, a big factor was that John retired.
Yes.
After 19, so you didn't have him there from 76 through '79 to
Right.
go along with all the other solo stuff at that time. So
Right,
yeah,
but also Ringo's career kind of went into decline after 76.
that's true. That's
Yeah,
true. We talked about that. So yeah, but those are memories that I keep with me. And American Top 40 with Casey Kasem was a very big part of my life. And thankfully that show, archival shows are being syndicated now.
sure.
And I listened to some of those old shows. In fact, Casey answered one of my questions.
Did he really?
So yes, he did. I remember it to this day.
What was it? What was your question?
Well, this was 1976, and I wanted to know who was the most successful artist as far as who had the most chart albums without ever having a single on the Hot 100.
Hmm.
And
Yoko.
no one amongst you would ever get it. And keep in mind, this may have changed since this was 1976 when it aired.
Mm.
But yeah, the answer was Jim Neighbors.
Ah,
Jim
Well, I
Neighbors.
would never have guessed that.
No,
Never,
Yeah.
never.
not in a million years.
So yeah,
Golly.
Casey said my name on American Top 40.
Wow.
Woo, woo. You were
That's
famous.
my brush with fame.
Hey.
Aside from working with you guys, that is.
Oh. For anybody that's interested in chart, there are some books out there that
All
you
the
can
Joel
get.
Whitburn stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I recently got a hold of the Guinness hit singles albums book, the British book, and
Mhm.
actually, if you look on Amazon, you can get them relatively cheaply.
Mhm.
The Whitburn books are a little more expensive.
Oh, they're a lot more expensive.
The Guinness books are pretty cheap,
Yeah.
which is surprising, and that has all the British chart stuff, and it's fascinating just to look through there. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I refer to a lot when I'm writing, but I mean, it's fascinating to look through, and especially the British stuff, because the British, a lot of the British artists that charted and hit big are not the same people that we know over here,
Oh, sure.
and so it's fascinating to see some of those names, over there that were, I mean, the Bay City Rollers, for example, are one, even though we know who they are over here, they were
Mhm.
much bigger over there than they were over here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, and that's not even a good example, really. I mean, there's just a lot of, I have the book sitting here, but I'm not going to take the time and go through it. But I mean, yeah, I mean, so if you're really interested in that stuff, that's a good, and there's also a couple of radio books. I know Ben Fong Torres did a radio book.
All right.
I can't, and the hits keep coming. Is that what it's?
Yeah, and the hits just keep on coming.
And there's a couple of other books too. And I know PBS did a radio special. I mean, a TV special on it a couple of years ago. But yeah, I mean, the whole radio issue of, especially in the '60s, is just fascinating. So there are all sorts of ways to explore it.
Yeah. It is fascinating to me what songs were hits in America that weren't hits in the UK. Not just the Beatles stuff and the solo Beatles stuff, but artists who charted in both countries, and vice
Right.
versa. Songs that
Yeah.
were big hits there that weren't hits here. So and also songs that were never released as singles here. Like we've talked about certain Beatles singles like 8 Days a Week. That were never a single in the UK, or The Long and Winding Road, or Nowhere Man, or those songs. So I find all that fascinating too.
And that brings up a point that I'm gonna probably get shot for saying, but the 8 Days a Week video in the new DVD is awesome. The Shay footage looks tremendous.
Mm.
Enough.
Yeah, we were talking.
We'll talk about that next week, all of
Yeah.
us.
Yes, we will.
We were talking a little bit before we began recording, and Allan and Steve, who have had access to the One Plus, both the CD and the DVDs, mentioned that it's there's a possibility that because of the quality of the 8 Days a Week video and I'm forgetting the other one.
Paris.
Yes,
The Paris video.
right. That that may be kind of a teaser for the Ron Howard directed film that'll be coming out, I guess, sometime next year.
Mm-hmm.
Or the
Beatles.
Shea film that they should put out.
Yeah,
anyhow,
right. Yeah.
Right, right. Oh God, yeah, that looks so good.
Yeah.
Anyway, enough
All
about
right.
that.
All right, that's a wrap on this show. If any of you would like to get in touch with us, you can do so at our email address, which is thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. You can also get in touch with us on Facebook at Things We Said Today, and also on Twitter at, what's the address, Steve?
Things we said fab. You can't remember that, can you?
No, I can't. Hey, you've got
That's all right.
you've got your own mental
Young enough
blocks
to
too,
like
there, Steve.
disco, old enough to not remember the name.
There we go. There we go.
That's all there is to me. I just like disco, nothing else, right,
Oh,
Alan?
okay. All right.
Right.
Okay. You're just going to give people this impression of me in every single show now, I guess. Also, if you would like to get in touch with me, Ken Michaels, if you want to talk Beatles or disco, then you can write at everylittlething at att.net. You can also catch my website, kenmichaelsradio.com. And funny, we should mention the Beatles One Plus, because hopefully by the time this is posted, if not a few days later, I'll be giving away copies of that on my website in a special contest. So that's at kenmichaelsradio.com. Al, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do so?
At Facebook under Al Sussman, or through Twitter at ASUSS49, or more directly through Beatlefan, www.beatlefan.com, or www.paradingpress.com.
And Alan, how about you?
The easiest way is probably at Facebook. Just either Alan Kozin or Alan Kozin Remixed, my alter ego. Also, if I can plug my review of the One Plus set, it's coming out, or will have come out by the time this is heard, and in the Wall Street Journal. You can find it on WSJ.com. And or you could just email me directly at alankozin@gmail.com.
All right. And you, Steve?
You can get me at BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. I'm on, if you search examiner.com for my name, you'll find me all over the place, because I do columns not only on the Beatles, but on vintage music and TV and all sorts of stuff. And I also have an ebook. I'm going to plug my ebook. It's not about the Beatles. It's about Davy Jones, my 2 interviews with Davy Jones. And it's called Meet a Monkey, Davy Jones. It's on Amazon, and it's on Barnes & Noble and several other places. So there we go.
All right, great. This has been wonderful, sharing our radio memories of the Beatles, group and solo. I'm Ken Michaels. Thanks so much for listening. And on behalf of Alan Kozin, Al Sussman, and Steve Marinucci, thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next time.